Recent studies reveal a concerning decline in reading habits among young people. In the UK, only 34.6% of children and young people aged 8 to 18 reported enjoying reading in 2024, and that is the lowest level since 2005. Additionally, just 20.5% of this age group read daily, making a significant decrease in regular reading habits. Similarly, in the United States, the 2024 National Assessment of Educational Progress indicated that average reading scores for 4th and 8th graders have decreased compared to previous years. And these trends underscore the urgent need to explore effective, evidence-based strategies to foster reading development and rekindle a love for reading among students. Joining us today is Kristy Jones, a renowned reading specialist dedicated to implementing evidence-based literacy instruction. Kristy has extensive experience in early intervention and supporting diverse learners. Well, welcome to the International Classroom Podcast, proudly sponsored by Lumio by Smart Technologies. Lumio transforms your lessons into engaging, interactive experiences that enhance collaboration and student participation. You can bring your lessons to life effortlessly with Lumio, empowering teachers and inspiring learners. And Lumio really emphasizes collaboration. Speaking of that, let's get on with our episode. Kristy, welcome to the International Classroom Podcast. Whereabouts in the world do we find you today?
I'm in Singapore. Alex, thanks for having me. So I've been in Singapore for 7 years now, coming up to 8 shortly. So yes, I'm here. You can see the picture behind me. It gives it away. It's not a window, unfortunately.
Please don't tell us you kind of want one of those office rooms where there is no windows.
Yes, I am. Correct.
All these people about well-being will be. Yeah, bless you. Well, thank you ever so much for taking the time to join us, and for those people, obviously, are really fine-tuned to the sound of the voice and the tone of your accent. There will be like, it's a curious dialect you've got there. Whereabouts are you originally from?
Originally, I'm from New Zealand. However, I grew up in Australia, so I left when I was quite young. I grew up in Australia. I grew up in Brisbane. And then I moved to the UK in my early 20s. I studied in the UK, did my degree there, and then back to Sydney for 10 years after I'd completed my degree, and then over to Singapore.
Fantastic. You really well-travelled then. And that kind of leads nicely into this first question, because obviously the field that you're in is kind of a very specialized field, isn't it? And like, what inspired your passion and for reading education and led you into this field?
I think, it actually began when I was quite young. So in New Zealand, I've come from a family of teachers, actually. So my grandfather was a teacher and a principal of a tiny school north of Wellington. And I'd always wanted to become a teacher when I was younger. Then the other trait that my family shares is reading. We love reading. We've always been passionate about reading. And then I did my degree in psychology, and I'd thought that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. After I'd finished my degree in Leeds and moved back to Sydney, I just happened to get a role in the cognitive science department in the reading research team, which also had a reading clinic attached to it. And it just fitted me so well. It was almost serendipitous that I ended up in this area. So I started in that role in 2008, and it just grew from there.
Amazing. Just out of curiosity there, Sydney to Leeds, how's the comparison?
I absolutely loved Leeds. I thought it was a brilliant city. I had so much fun there. I think when you live somewhere that's completely different from where you've grown up, you kind of enjoy it in a different way. But I actually found out that my European side of my family from New Zealand had Yorkshire roots, so I felt very comfortable there.
Amazing. Yeah. My wife's Yorkshire. In fact, my family originate from Yorkshire as well. So as my father-in-law likes to say, Yorkshire's God's country.
Yes, God's own country, for sure.
That's it. Now, science of reading, obviously, I've not come across this previously. I just thought, for me, secondary reading is reading, but actually there's a lot more to it, isn't there? Can you just help us, and then give us the easy version, as it were? What is the science of reading?
So, the science of reading draws from research in education, psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. And it looks at ways and how we learn to read. And so, one of the big focuses of the science of reading are its 5 core principles. So the 5 core principles of the science of reading are phonemic awareness, so recognizing and working with sounds in words. There's also phonics, so knowing that letters correspond to a specific sound. Fluency, which includes reading rate and reading accuracy. And these elements help with comprehension, vocabulary, so the understanding of words, which also supports comprehension, and then comprehension itself, which is our purpose for reading. So you read for meaning. And so these are known really as the big 5 in reading. So if we take all of those elements and combine them, and if somebody is a proficient reader, all of those elements will be effectively working.
And obviously through that, we've mentioned the use of scientific evidence and research-based and research-informed practices with this. How does that go about guiding the development of reading curricula and especially then the teaching methods that go with it?
Well, I think part of it, the science of reading, is that it's important to remember that there are other elements that come into being a proficient reader too. So if we talk about using multisensory strategies to help reading instruction be effective, if we talk about using positive behavior strategies to support reading instruction as well, and enjoyment in reading really matters too. And so when we combine these with the science of reading and we think about what a classroom curriculum would look like, based on these core principles, we can consider for early readers from K to 1 to build a solid basis for reading proficiency. There's plenty of phonics reading programs out there. However, the ones that you want to identify as being effective for students would also include phonemic awareness within the program itself. And when we talk about phonemic awareness within the program itself, we talk about direct phonemic awareness. And so what that means is there's different elements to reading. So when we know what sounds letters make, we need to make sure that we're able to put those sounds together when we read a word. So say, for example, a student comes across a word like trip. They're in K, or they're in year 1. They've never read that word before. But if they know that, T makes a T sound, R makes a R sound, I makes a S sound, and P makes a P sound, they're able to put those sounds together if they can blend. And that's one of the phonemic awareness strategies that would support that too. So you would want that within a program. The other consideration would be within your curriculum would be to have a regular word teaching, or what we call high frequency sight words. And so these are words that can't be decoded using phonics skills. So even if you think about the word the, if you used phonics to read it, you'd read it as the and so that would be a high frequency sight word that we would expect, K and 1 students to be able to read. So those should be included within a program as well.
Okay, because from educators out there, and I obviously am a secondary school educator, and we don't deal a lot with this. We're not educated a lot with this, and it's almost this misconception to maybe, or a pushing away of whose responsibility is this, that we see it then being pushed onto primary school teachers or early years teachers. And I'm more aware of it, of having my own children, and I'm gone through it with them. But and we said at the start about then this gap and the decrease in students who are enjoying reading and want to read, or who kind of read daily. What is the significance of this, do you think, in terms of, we talk about foundational reading skills, but even just foundational learning skills?
Mm-hmm. So with reference to significance of this, as in where does it stem from? Is that what you mean, Alex?
Yeah, and we were talking about, obviously, this is really important. And obviously some of the words that you've really well described there for us, I'd never come across phonemic. I know what phonics was, but phonemic to me is what? And as a biologist, I'm teaching students all these new words. We're talking, we've just done the kidney in year 10. So things like the loop of Henle or nephrons. And there's a lot of new words. It's almost like learning a new language. And I'm thinking to myself, if I actually understood how students learn to read, if I understood the components of this, would it allow me to therefore be a better instructor, facilitator, for them to understand the word, the meaning, and the process that takes place? Because again, I offset it to primary school. I think, this is reading. This is just reading. Primary school, you should be able to deal with it. It's like, but actually what we're saying here is, or what I think here is, it's actually a whole educational issue. But my question is really like, why should secondary teachers care? That's really what I want to get at in terms of, the significance of this reading and how we take on board information, the impact it has on learning.
Yeah, I think it is tricky for secondary teachers because once students reach secondary school, the, teaching of skills like reading and basic mathematics, we've moved on from that in the curriculum. And the expectation is that the students know how to read proficiently. And that isn't something that a secondary teacher needs to be concerned about. And so I think, part of that, comes from, there's other influences, I think, in the modern world that we need to be aware of that take students' attention away from, just grabbing a book at home and so on, and being able to, take that time at home to read really reinforces the strategies that they're being taught in school. So I actually always say to parents, look, leave the technical stuff to the educators and to people like us when it comes to teaching reading. But what should be happening at home is, building the enjoyment of reading. If that's not happening at home, I think that that's where things start to fall down a little bit. And that people have very busy lives. And so I do understand, people are traveling for work and so on, and time is precious now, particularly if both parents are extremely busy. So I think we just don't have the time and the luxury anymore to help our children read as much as we might have done, years and years ago. I think from a secondary teacher's perspective, being able to know, I guess, the basic fundamentals about what it takes to be a proficient reader would help to identify those students who might need additional support outside of what the school is able to cater for, because, typically in secondary schools, they don't have a learning support department that, specifically teaches foundational skills. And so if a secondary teacher is able to go, right, I can see this student can't, use their phonemic awareness skills, they can't blend, they can't, their spelling needs support, then that's when, they can reach out and see what additional support could be provided.
And you mentioned a few things there about what we should be looking out for potentially. So the blending and the phonomics and the phonemic, the patterns that are used. It's like, why is then this intervention and the early intervention and identifying of this? Why is that critical for reading success? And especially in terms of then from a parent side or a teacher side going, there's a difference between a student who's struggling to read versus a student with specific learning disabilities.
So I think, when we think about education, if we consider it as an inverted pyramid, so, down the bottom is where students start with their learning in KN1, and that's where they're getting all the foundational teaching that's happening for the reading and spelling skills. Once they start to move up from play-based learning and those foundational skills into more inquiry-based learning, and they're moving into STEM and language arts and so on, there's just more of a gap for them to catch up on. So if we can find these students who need support early, then we can tackle those foundational skills then and there, and there isn't as much of a gap to catch up on. So what can typically happen is the recommendation for students who are struggling is to wait for a formal diagnosis until they're 7 years old. And the reason for that is because the diagnostic assessments, the normative data, starts from about 7. And so the reason for that is, and it's very good, there are very good reasons for it, because, they want to make sure that the child has had access to enough education to be able to do a diagnostic assessment that says, with this amount of education, the child is still struggling with reading. And then there's also other elements that come into it. So perhaps for their age and intelligence level, they're still struggling. The student is showing signs of reading difficulties across multiple subjects and settings. But regardless of that, we can still support a student with intervention if they're struggling with reading before they go and do a formal diagnosis to find out if they have dyslexia or specific language disorder for reading, or, ADHD, which can also affect reading proficiency as well. So we can still do an assessment and use the components of the science of reading, so those 5 core components, to find out which parts of reading is the student struggling with, and then build a targeted program catered to that. So then we only need to focus on the things that the student is struggling in.
And obviously throughout, you mentioned earlier, and I can attest to this as a parent with 2 young children, life is busy. And, the modern day with technology and iPads and screen time makes things very challenging. What would you be saying to parents to help support them with getting their children to read and develop their reading at home?
Yeah, I think, this is something that I get asked a lot from most parents who come to see me, and it's understandable, that they're looking to find further tips that support their children at home. And so there's a few kind of simple strategies actually that parents can use at home if their child is learning to read or they're struggling to read. And one of those things is using their finger. The child uses their finger to track the word as they're reading, because it actually helps their eyes to focus in on the word. But if the parent is reading with the child as well, then they can use their finger too. So the child will look at the picture, and, if you're reading picture books, but they'll also track along with the parent's finger at times too. And so you're actually mirroring, ideally mirroring habits that the child would pick up on. The other thing to consider is things like putting subtitles on screens. So even if the child is, they're on their iPad and they're watching kids' YouTube, you can put the subtitles on. They're watching Netflix, you can put the subtitles on. And so if we're not getting as much exposure to print, as we call it, through reading books, we're still getting exposure to print through screens. And exposure to print helps with building vocabulary. But, it's correlated with improved comprehension. And so, that's one of the big elements within research as well is, how much exposure to print does a child get to support their reading habits? The other thing I also say to parents is, there's a lot of reluctance for their children to read graphic novels, and I'm one of those parents too. I've seen some of the graphic novels that my son loves, and I'm like, this is the best reading, but he enjoys it. And so it's like, if your child is reading something that you don't 100% love, but they enjoy it, just let them do it. It's building that joy of reading. And that is a big factor. And I know I've said it a few times now, but we do have students who come in and they just do not like reading. We'll have another student come in who is unable to read, but when we look at their profiles of their reading abilities, they're very similar. The student who enjoys reading more will make gains faster than the student who really doesn't like reading.
And when you say gains, what is it you're referring to there?
So when we have a student come to see us, we will do, as I mentioned, an assessment. And for example, we might measure their phonics. So what we are measuring there is the individual letter sound correspondences. So the letter sound correspondences are, for example, if they see the letter S, they know that it makes a S sound. And then we might show them SH. Do they know that it makes a sh sound? There's about 63 that we will measure. And so when we see a student and we can find which letter sound correspondences they're struggling with, they're the ones that we target with an intervention program. Then we will do a progress assessment, say after 25 sessions or at the end of a term, to see how much progress is made. And then ideally what we would find is the targeted letter sound correspondences are now, confidently being read. And, we are hoping during that time in school as well, they're also learning different letter sound correspondences. So those are the gains that we speak about.
Thank you. It's fascinating when you said about the subtitles, by the way, on TVs and Netflix, because a few different people have been out when we talk about interventions and supporting students, sort of the text to speech and other things, of all saying the same thing. And even students and adults who don't need subtitles, like now, I think it's just on all the time in my house for Netflix and everything. And yeah, I never thought anything of it. And the more I hear people say about it, the more it starts to make sense. And again, from my own students who somewhat are not always reluctant, but, it's a challenge sometimes to get to read. And my daughter loves sort of more graphic novels and cartoon based like books. And so we're happy to let her read. But it's a really good point about developing vocabulary. But is there any other ways, and I'm just thinking now in terms of, does it always have to be reading, and we're talking about, obviously, like you said, in print. Are there other ways that parents can support their children to expand their vocabulary?
So there are strategies that parents can use to expand a child's vocabulary. Yes, we talk about finding words in print, and it's great to have conversations with your child. If you're reading something together and you see a word and you're like, I'm not sure that they know what that word means, and then talking about it while you're reading together. But I think, in terms of other ways to build vocabulary, you're out and about. You might be, going into a restaurant. On the menu, there's something they've never seen before. We can talk about that. When we're in museums and so on, there's a lot we can talk about there where they, probably haven't been exposed to certain words before. Even when you're watching, TV, movies together and so on, you can definitely, more often than not, the child will come across a word that they don't necessarily know the meaning to. And one of the strategies I think as well is that we like to use here in the office with our students is when they've read a passage and there's a word in there and we're pretty sure they won't know the meaning of that word, is asking them what they think the word means, so finding out first, because sometimes they're right. They may never have heard that word before, but within the context of the passage, they're able to work out the meaning. And so that's always really interesting too. If they know it without, knowing the definition of the word, but they've used context. And that's a really fun way to build vocabulary with children and students too.
Yeah, I have that, again, living off my own experiences, my own too, like certain words they'll come out and use. And so tell me what that means, and actually just talking with I say students, but talking with children and talking to your own children and actually utilizing the words and vocabulary and then talking about what they mean. I think that's a great way. And even songs, I always find amazing. Like my youngest daughter especially, would just be a song comes on and she's like word for word just going through, and sort of I find that helps her a little bit with developing maybe just pronunciation, and so not necessarily always understanding the word, but how she pronounces words and how she moves from one word to the next. I think is really interesting for her, and seeing her vocabulary development, because I find that she was very much like me as a child. I remember going to speech therapy in primary school because I struggled not necessarily with reading per se, but with speaking, with probably some of the things that you may see in terms of pronunciation of words and how I move from one word to the next. I see that in her a little bit. And I wonder if that's as a kind of segue across, when I was probably consider myself very sort of, I was an academic, I was sporty at school, but I didn't have an issue per se with the reading side of things. Whether we then see that in terms of one is reading, but also, as you say, that the other components of, let's say, pronunciation and vocabulary side of things, what we call quiet underachievers. And I think maybe that's a term that's coming more to the forefront now. So before we just sort of go to unpack that, what to you, if we just give a very simple definition, is a quiet underachiever?
So they're a tricky little bunch, quite underachievers. So they're usually the students in the classroom who, they're normally polite, they're very well behaved, they're very insightful, rarely disruptive. They, appear to be engaged, but they struggle with work output and focus or confidence. Sometimes they're daydreaming. They might be completing tasks too quickly with minimal effort, but there's a bit of a disconnect between, the output and their behavior. So, these sometimes are students who are falling between the gaps of being able to keep up within the classroom, but they don't quite qualify for in-school learning support.
And what would be, obviously you mentioned some of the things there, like that indicate that students are quite underachiever. When you come across those, and I imagine now we're all starting to think about our strategies as teachers do, but what would be some of your interventions that you would put in place to help probably improve then that output, as it were, and also probably improve their reading skills?
Yeah, well, where possible, trying to find the root cause of, the underachievement, based on their intelligence, and trying to determine, is this because there might be an attention problem? So one of the traits of students who have the inattentive form of ADHD is that they can, quietly get on with the classroom and the students and the teacher, but because they're so distracted, they're not necessarily given the output that you would expect. The other trait that sometimes these students can have is problems with anxiety, and so the thought process from those students is, well, if I just keep quiet, nobody will speak to me, and I won't be asked to stand up in front of the class or, share my work and those sorts of things as well. So once you can determine, what is the root cause for this behavior, or what is the root cause for being an underachiever for this particular student, then you can either recommend an educational psychologist assessment, maybe to see if ADHD is indeed the issue. If it's an anxiety, there's actually screeners which are very low cost, which pick up on reading anxiety in particular. But if there's other forms of anxiety, then you might want to think about, seeing a clinical psychologist or something like that. When there was some research done back in 2021, which looked at anxiety and reading intervention for students who were quite underachievers. And when they did the reading intervention alongside of support with either a psychologist or a counsellor, that's when the most improvements were being seen with this particular group of students.
Now, before we continue with today's episode, I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Lumio by Smart Technologies. Now, imagine turning your standard lessons into dynamic, interactive experiences where every student is fully engaged. And Lumio lets you effortlessly blend videos, interactive quizzes, collaborative activities, and real-time feedback directly on student devices. Now, as educators, we love tools that make our jobs easier and learning more impactful, and Lumio does exactly that. You can check out Lumio and start transforming your classroom today by heading to lum.io, or you can click in the link in our show notes. Now, back to the episode. So, if I was going to play devil's advocate for this one, I'm going to say, there might be parents out there, even students out there listening to this, going, well, reading's not that important anymore. Everything can be video, and with the technology we've got now, if they don't get it reading wise, they can sound it out. We've seen text to speech, haven't we? It's like, what do you say to those parents, to those students who kind of just, push it aside and think it's not an important skill anymore?
Well, yes, there is text to speech, but reading is everywhere. You can't avoid it. There's even in terms of in school, every subject involves reading to an extent, except if you're actually doing PE outside, it's unavoidable. Once you, start university, you can use text to speech if you like, but, it's going to be quite difficult to be able to do all the research you'll need to do within a university setting just with that alone. Once you're in a professional workplace or, what have you in terms of your career, there is going to be some element of reading needed. And, I think back in, even when I was a child, for people with reading difficulties and dyslexia, finding the right interventions was near impossible. And I think now we're lucky enough to be in a stage where, finding intervention isn't as difficult as it used to be, and evidence-based interventions are available. And I think now we just don't have an excuse to not try something if a student is struggling with reading.
Yeah, definitely. And that would kind of then follow on to the more pro question is really, do we think we should be doing more reading in secondary across all subjects?
This is a difficult one, I suppose, for me to answer. And I say it's difficult only because I think, the expectation on secondary students is already quite high. I think, there is a lot of pressure on secondary students, as they head towards year 12 and doing GCSEs or IGCSEs and so on. I wouldn't necessarily want to say that, students in secondary should be doing more reading. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the answer, because in my mind, there's two types of reading. There's reading that you do for fun, and there's reading that you do for work and, for educational purposes. And so I think, to say, should students in secondary school do more reading for enjoyment? Yes. For secondary subjects, I'm not saying they should do less reading, by the way, but I don't know if more reading is the answer.
Yeah, it's. I think with the time we are at the moment in this year, we've got 3-4 months to the exams. Then it's reading for learning and reading for revision. It's taxing, is what I find, and it takes a lot out when you're reading to really absorb. And my kids ask me this. It's like, Dad, you don't read, and I said, because my job is a lot of reading. My job is reading other people's work. It's reading these things, and I don't necessarily then want to read for pleasure. Like I read for learning, or that's part of my job. So it's trying to model good behaviors, which is also the challenge if you are in a workplace where you do a lot of reading. I can see that as a challenge, but as you say, you sit and read with them or go through it. I think it's just finding that time. But no, thank you for answering that one for me, because you're right. I don't think there is a hard and fast rule. There isn't a magic bullet for this one at all at the moment. I think it's more of what you mentioned earlier. It's the ability to identify the students who can't, and therefore, because that will limit their access to the information and to all the tasks we do. If you think about how most people teach, we start with some form of PowerPoint or worksheet or question, and it's always up there. And yes, and we're going to go into this, the technology to support it, but the fundamental basics, like what room are you in? And if you can't identify that, it's going to be a struggle. But it does go into the technology side of things, and it would be remiss of me not to ask about AI at this moment in time and AI-based reading programs. Before we go into it, just to start with, what are your thoughts regarding sort of AI-based online reading programs?
So I've come across a few, and, people often ask me about them as well. The ones that I have seen, can they teach reading? Short answer is no, not from what I've seen so far. But that's not to say it won't happen, because I'm sure it will. I've no doubt there'll be something coming soon, in development, it's happening. The current apps that are out there, though, they just don't have the natural language models that are required to pick up on errors. So, for example, there's a few out there at the moment which are present a story, and the student's supposed to read along with the bouncing ball. And if the student makes an error, then the app or the AI is supposed to respond and let them know that they've made an error. But the error rates, or I should say the correction rates, are very low and inaccurate from what we've seen. So they don't analyze the responses as well as they should yet. Yeah, I think, I'm working with some researchers at the moment on some interesting projects around AI and developing reading apps. They don't use the science of reading as a model yet in these reading apps either. So they're definitely not teaching reading. I think they're good supplements for, teaching reading, but I don't think we can say that they're ready yet to replace teaching reading in the classroom.
Yeah, thank you for that. Are there any sort of tools out there or technology out there that's being integrated effectively, and whilst obviously maintaining the human side of things? Is there anything you would be recommending from a technological standpoint?
Not that uses AI just yet. Not that I've seen. I think, when we look at all the research around, AI in the classroom and so on, I think, most of the research recognizes that the hybrid of, teaching with AI as a support tool rather than a doing tool is what has the best outcomes so far. And, there's quite a prominent AI learning assistant tool that's used in the US at the moment. And when they've gone and, done the research on how effective it is, they've actually seen declines in writing performance and reading accuracy. And so tools that use AI are not quite ready at that level just yet. I think if we think about online apps and so on, which are great. There's apps like Nessie, which is a fantastic app. It's for younger students, that supports reading with phonics instruction. There's other tools out there like Literacy Planet. That's a great one too. But neither of these really engage AI to the level that I think we're going to see in the very short future.
Yeah. I find it interesting thinking about where technology is taking us, and yet what everyone says are fundamental skills that we need to keep. And if anything, where our students are struggling with, obviously some of that being reading is always one. And there's some fantastic, being able to speak with some fantastic people in the UK, like Pobble, for example, is one platform that's doing amazing things. And but the other one that really comes back is oracy. And there's a big drive on that, especially here in the UE, and I think within the UK, about, we talk about it kind of measures the same, but the vocabulary of our students, of our children, and how they communicate. But it's so interesting, and you may find this as well, the more you speak to younger students, that they are empire builders. They create, and the language they now use and the words they come out with now are just different. I think is the best way. Not good, not bad, but they do create their own languages, don't they? Is that something that, in terms of with the students you speak to and you get to interact with on a day-to-day basis, from a reading side of things, then how they start to communicate and talk with each other? It's like, do you see that as a good thing? Is it on the fence? Is it a negative thing? Like this language creation that they're going through, like, what's your take on that?
It's an unstoppable force, Alex. I think, we just have to accept that that is the way that, technology is going. And therefore, the language that we use changes. Language has evolved over the, centuries anyway. And I think, technology, has progressed exponentially over the last, century as well. And so I think, it's good because we have to adapt, that we have no choice but to adapt, and so we need to be able to evolve our language, and almost the younger students are our AI natives. I'm from that generation that remembers using cassette tapes and record players, and now my son is talking, even just last night he was talking to me about AI and how it's going to take over the world. So I think we just have to accept that it's coming and actually embrace it, for all of its flaws. And there's no doubt there's going to be some flaws and some, things that are not pleasant, which are already out there now, but there's going to be some amazing things that come with it too. And so I think, in terms of when we think about reading and education, with the right AI tools, it will be such a benefit. I have no doubt of that.
I'm just curious then, have any of your students called you bro yet?
Not yet. I'm sure it's coming though. I'm sure it's coming. My son's 11, so I've no doubt it's coming.
My daughter's already called. I again just want a language and continuation of my daughter has, and a student at school did, and it's the equivalent of almost, I think, when we were in school and I was in school, calling one of the teachers mum or dad. It's like
yes.
It's that, and all the other, have you seen the memes like that are on TikTok or Instagram of these teachers in leadership who are doing what do they call them now, the Gen Alpha, I think, the language and how they're talking about these things. I think it's wonderful. We did it in our generation. There's certain words that we use that we've created in the older generations, and you're right in terms of the evolution of language and how it goes, and creating things and meanings for things, and feeling as a generation connected. And it just makes it more challenging, I think, for us, as it were, in terms of just to understand them in any other way, just to understand, but it's exciting for them. Moving on, as we start to wrap this up, just have a quick fire rounds that we've brought in for this one. And so my first question for you is what is a common misconception about teaching reading?
A common misconception I have seen regarding teaching reading is that once a child knows how to read using phonics, then they can read well. And unfortunately, that's just not true. So when we think about the English language, and there's only 80% of words that can be phonetically decoded. English is not a phonetic language. There's that other 20%, which, have all the irregularities because, it's been had Germanic languages influence it and, the Latin languages and so on. And so because we've brought all of that into the English language and we're now a beautiful hybrid of these different languages, it means that students need to be able to read what I call irregular words, so words that don't follow phonetic rules. And the other thing to consider, is phonics enough? We need to also think about vocabulary and comprehension as well, because we do come across students who have wonderful reading skills, but they don't know what they've read because their vocabulary and their comprehension just isn't where it needs to be for their age.
I think it reminds me of that video when you said that. There's a gentleman with the flipboard, and he has the word written on it. And he pronunciates it, and then he puts down the next word, which makes it think like it's like if you had the word though, and then you went to like trough in English, and everyone pronounces it, and it just keeps going with that, and just the irregularity of our languages. It's silly.
Yes.
It's silly.
And there's a wonderful bit from Michael McIntyre when he does his stand-up, and he talks about, and he doesn't realize he's talking about irregular words, but he kind of says irregular words phonetically, and it is a fantastic example of how difficult English can be.
Yeah. I remember that one. I've seen that one as well. Right, next one. Recommend a resource for parents to support reading at home. What would you recommend?
I mentioned the Nessie app. I think that's a fantastic app for learning to read for children and for children who are struggling as well. So not just your K and your ones, but older children as well in primary level. One of the other apps that I think is absolutely fantastic is Epic, which is a digital online library. There's so many books to choose from. The children have all different genres that they can read. It goes up to quite an older level for students. So it's not just in that foundational stage, which a lot of apps can be. They really just target foundational and young students, but it suits older students as well. And one of the great features that Epic has, particularly for those students who struggle with reading, is it has the audio that will read the book and have the bouncing ball, so the student can actually see the words as it's being read to them. Some parents wonder if that's what their children should be using, and I'm like, absolutely. If they enjoy it, then it's that exposure to print again and seeing the words on the screen as they're being read as well. It all helps.
Yeah, amazing recommendation. Thank you. And Nessie, one piece of advice you would give to new reading specialists?
My piece of advice would be, don't just deliver the program. Get to know your students, get to know the nuances that they bring. We're quite lucky in that we get to see students one-on-one, as well as in small groups. And so having seen students since 2008, I can tell you we still have students that come and see us with different learner profiles, different literacy profiles, and, with their unique backgrounds and personalities and diverse needs. It's us that need to adapt to the student so they can reach their full literacy potential. So fostering a love of reading as well. And sometimes I will say it's not always possible. Some students will just not like reading, and we have to accept that, but we need to try. And then using multisensory approaches to help reinforce reading strategies, and then also positive behavior strategies as well, will get the best results.
Just unpacking that, a multisensory approach to reading, what's that?
So multisensory approach to reading could be using a song to learn a particular sound. So I don't know if your children ever sung songs about, ants on the apple, for example. Or, using their finger to trace in the air or to trace onto sand, kinetic sand, using, little blocks that have letters on them to, create words and create sounds. They include multisensory approaches.
Wonderful. Well, Kristy, thank you for so much for coming on today and just sharing this expertise. If we were to summarize everything, there's one key takeaway or general takeaways that you would like the listeners to remember about effective reading instruction, what would it be?
It would be that, yes, phonics is an important foundational skill. And once that student learns that skill, then yes, they will be able to decode many new words independently and confidently. But it's not the whole story. So I think, to remember that there's other components to becoming a proficient reader that need to be included within the curriculum and within the day-to-day.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And lastly, if people wanted to find you, learn more about it, and just sort of follow the work that you do, where is the best place for them to make contact?
So you can visit our website, thereadingspecialist.org. We're also on LinkedIn, so we're the Reading Specialists on LinkedIn. But if you had any questions for me, I've mentioned various resources and so on, or you want further information about some of the research that we've looked into and that we've done, you can connect with me on LinkedIn as well, under Kristy Jones.
Amazing. Again, thank you ever so much for coming to speak with us on the International Classroom podcast and just shining a light on something that I think we all know is really important, but maybe just don't know enough about and how to go about identifying and improving and developing. So really, really appreciate that insight from you today. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Alex.
Thanks again to Lumia by Smart Technologies, our podcast sponsor. You can transform your classroom into an interactive, student-centered learning environment today. Visit aliwem.io to find out how.